Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you with us. Since the federal minimum wage was voted into law back in 1938, we have now gone through the longest period without a rise in the minimum wage. It's been 9 years, 10 years almost since it last happened under President Barack Obama. States and cities have raised that minimum wage to $15 an hour across the country, often not seeing the actual wage take place until many years later after it was implemented. However you parse it, the actual value of the minimum wage has actually diminished since the late 1960s. Why has it not been raised? Why have we not kept up with it? Who's right when they have this argument? The conservatives and business leaders and interests who say when the minimum wage is raised, you only help youth and not the poor and actually hurt job growth? Or progressives, when people on the left say that minimum wages raises the living standards of the poorest Americans and it's the only way to do it? Well, we are joined by Josh Hoxas, who is director of the Project on Opportunity and Taxation, the Institute for Policy Studies. And Josh, welcome to Real News. Pleasure to have you with us.
It's great to be with you, Mark.
So, this is really, it always has this conundrum. We always have this battle of what the minimum wage really means. So let's talk a bit about that. And when you read what comes out of some conservative policy think tanks and business think tanks, it's that the minimum wage actually slows job growth, does not go to poor people. For the most part, it goes to young people. That it's either for young people or for spouses who are secondary income to the household. Others saying that it uplifts, like the Economic Policy Institute study, talking about how it lifts the lives of the poor. So let's talk about what it does and doesn't do and why this argument is taking place.
Yeah, so there's this narrative out there that the minimum wage doesn't go to poor people, or it goes to mostly teenagers or kids. It's sort of magical thinking. And I think where it comes from is really not wanting to engage around the issues of real working people. Because the prototypical minimum wage worker, if we're to look at who's the statistical middle, uh, over half, 60% work full time, over half are women, and over 90% are not teenagers. They're older than being a teenager. So we're not talking about kids.
I hate to interrupt you. Just a quick question. The stat you just threw out there. Now, I've spent all this time just finished reading some right conservative reports in Time magazine where they say just the opposite. That is, in fact, it's because people are working part-time, that they're not working full-time jobs and getting the minimum wages is the problem why they can't make it on the money they have, or B, that it is going mostly to younger people. So, how do we know what the reality is?
So consider this, the minimum wage does not pay enough to afford an apartment in any city in the country. There's not a place that you can live where you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment working on the minimum wage. So when we see these numbers around who are working in these jobs, the families that I'm describing, the people who are working minimum wage jobs, the stats show up. They actually do make themselves known in different places. It's not just about what happens when you make so little income that you're at the minimum wage. It's the 1 in 4 Americans who are skipping medical treatment because they can't afford the cost. The 1 in 5 who have zero or negative net wealth. The 2 in 5 who can't come up with $400 cash if they needed to in emergency. So these aren't all minimum wage workers I'm describing, but the minimum wage is contributing to this dynamic where people are so behind on their economic expenses, their finances, that shows up in a lot of different ways. And it ends up costing society a lot more. The thing I don't understand about conservative arguments around this issue is it's actually really expensive for the government to have a really low federal minimum wage. If you think about what it costs to cover the basic living expenses of somebody who makes so little money, they're on public housing assistance, there's food assistance programs, and I'm fully in favor of these programs. Supplemental nutrition assistance programs, also known as food stamps. It's also very expensive to the federal government. Whereas if we had a higher minimum wage, their employers would be paying this. So, Senator Sanders came out a year ago blasting Amazon for paying sub-poverty wages and saying, it's not the Amazon workers who are the chief beneficiaries of these poverty wages and subsequent public programs that supplement them. It's really Jeff Bezos and his shareholders who are getting this huge corporate subsidy in the form of food stamps and housing assistance programs because they're not paying their workers enough to live on. And as a result, Amazon made a plan to raise their base wage, and a lot of companies are following suit. So this sort of name and shame game has worked a little bit with these large employers, but there's still a tremendous number of employers who will not raise wages unless they're forced to by the government.
So if you look at what's happened, and the studies have pretty clearly shown that the minimum wage is the value of the minimum wage is lessened over the last 20, 40 years in this country. We haven't raised it significantly in the last 10 years. So talk a bit about why that is. What is the politics? What is the climate of our country that allows a minimum wage not to be passed by the federal government that actually would have some effect on the lives of the poor citizens in our country?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back to when the minimum wage peaked in 1968, if it had kept pace with inflation today, it would have been $12 an hour over the $7.25 that it currently is. If you look back to what life was like in 1968, labor unions were a lot stronger. We had a burgeoning labor movement that was still growing. You had a resistance from workers who were coming together. A lot of that movement, the social movement that led to the first minimum wage that you described under FDR, the striking workers and people who were out in the streets demanding it. A lot of that has been really squandered over the past several decades by people not coming together, not demanding it, and the sort of financialization of our lives where we're struggling. People are not able to really do more than they're currently being able to do. And if you look at where the numbers show up, just the facts and figures, if the minimum wage had grew with productivity, if it had gone up as we've become more productive, it would be $20 an hour today. And if it had gone up with the pace of Wall Street bonuses since the 1980s, it'd be $33 today.
Now, where does that number come from?
That comes from my colleague at the Institute for Policy Studies named Sarah Anderson, who
Oh,
looked
yeah,
at this issue and has been studying Wall Street bonuses for decades now.
So you mentioned a moment ago the role of unions, and I think that we don't often take into account what the diminishment of the political power of unions and numbers of people who are actually organized in unions, number of people being organized by unions today, the unorganized, the effect it has on battles and fights around the minimum wage.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of this comes down to class, which Chomsky called the only four-letter or five-letter, four-letter word, right? So a lot of this has to do with people who are looking around at their circumstances and thinking, "Man, this is really harsh, this is brutal, and this is my fault." And that individualism around, if I don't make more money, it's my fault, has really been a corporate coup for the folks who are profiting off of our current wage structure, because that keeps people separated. If you look around at a wage structure and think, I'm making $7.25 and that's my fault why I can't get by, then you're not saying it's a structural inequality problem like it is. And you're not saying we as a group should come together and can come together to demand a better life and livelihood for our families. And the declining power of labor unions over time, which is really if you look at the inverse, the rising power of corporations over my lifetime, we're seeing much more consolidation of economic wealth and power over time. And the result of that is that poor people have become more poor. I mean, and the corporations are profiteering off of this gap between the cost of living continuing to go up and wages stagnating.
There's a chart here will pop up, and it shows, I think, really the extent of what we're talking about from the Economic Policy Institute. When it said who would benefit if the federal minimum wage is raised to $15 by 2024, 39, almost 40 million Americans, over 38 million people 18 and over, almost 24 million full-time workers, 23 million women, 11 million parents, almost 5.5 million single parents, parents of 14.5 million children. I mean, this is not an insignificant number of people who would be affected by a $15 an hour minimum wage that in itself doesn't even keep up with what it takes to survive in this world.
Yeah, I mean, we started this segment talking about with the facts, and I think the Economic Policy Institute (EPI), I think they put out really non-biased, very straightforward numbers. I use them. A lot of people use them. I don't think that conservative think tanks can pick apart their number producing. I do think that there's a convenient narrative that says, "Oh, the minimum wage is just for my teenage son." And my theory on that is that maybe these folks, the only minimum wage workers they actually know are their own teenage children. We've seen this the stratification of society. Maybe they just don't spend any time around working people. It's entirely plausible that a lot of these folks could go their whole lives without developing any meaningful relationships with people who make this poverty wage. And the reality is, this is tens of millions of people. Like I said, 60% work full time. A third of them have children. Most of them are women. Almost all, 90% of them are not teenagers. So, I mean, these are the bank tellers, the cashiers, the folks at your retail stores, the folks at grocery stores, the servers. We haven't even talked about the sub minimum wage, the tipped minimum wage, which is $2.13 an hour.
Which are
I
often not
mean,
even allowed to be part of a minimum wage bill in most localities. They don't include people who make tips.
that's entirely true. And the facts of the matter is that, these people are invisible to the folks who are largely talking about. There's a story in their head around who are the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, and that makes them feel better about our current wage structure, which is morally reprehensible. And there's a good moral argument and a moral movement that's growing in the form of the Poor People's Campaign to say enough is enough. And people are coming together in the wake of a lack of a movement to try and build something to bring people together.
So very quickly here, let me just close with this. I'm curious, as you look at this and you talked about Poor People's Campaign and the work that they're doing, how do you see this playing out in the next year and a half over this electoral period in 2020 elections? I mean, some people say it would be a death knell to keep pushing $15 an hour. Others saying it's a way to kind of broaden the base. How do you see this playing out in this election?
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever go back to a time when we're going to say, like, we need to have lower minimum wage, or we need to, we really need to compromise on this issue. I'm aware that there are a conservative and a loud conservative movement in this country that says, takes umbrage with the very concept of a minimum wage. They don't think that there should be a minimum wage. If an employer wants to pay you $1 an hour and you're willing to take it, then that should be the wage and period. And I saw that, I worked on Capitol Hill. I saw these arguments being made in committee hearings in front of cameras and behind closed doors. This is a true believer population. So that's there. The good news is that most people understand that the minimum wage is less than the cost of living, and that that's wrong. So you have a moral argument that is compelling to people. The Fight for 15 has been incredibly successful at the state level in a number of states and growing number of states. And I don't see that going backwards. What I do see is this politics of resentment growing up where folks are thinking, oh, I made $7 and a quarter and now I make more. You should make $7 and a quarter until you can do better or do this or do that. And I don't think that side will win. I don't have polling that supports it. I don't have a very giant campaign. I just know that these 40 million people that we're talking about are starting to become organized in a way that they weren't previously. And I think that is a very dangerous thing to the plutocratic power that's been exploiting them for a long, long time.
Well, Josh Hoxie, director of the Project on Opportunity and Taxation.